So first of all, I want to thank the organizers for having invited me. I'm very proud about this. My lecture will be somewhat different from the other ones in the sense that it will be more compact. I'm going to study one episode in the history of economics about which it is worth the while to ask the question, is it the Copernican game change, or is it a change which probably might experience a return? And the episode that I want to study is the empirical turn that took place in economics. And so most economists know about the name empirical turn. It is very often used now. And I want to examine so my lecture will be a sort of pondering upon that episode. So the plan of my lecture is very simple. It will have just 4 parts. And the first is an introduction where I want to evoke in a few slides what is this empirical turn. First of all, there is statistical information that I may give you from a paper by Angris and other authors. And so it is a very huge machine learning experience where there were about 135,000 journals that were examined and from the 1980 to 2015. And so what I found in this experience was a huge decrease in theoretical papers from 60 to 37%, and huge empirical contrasted with a huge empirical increase from 34 to 54% of publications. So this is really very significant. So the question we may ask is what lies behind this turn? And so there are many possible interpretations. On the one hand, so they're quoted there. You see, it can be a rebuttal of traditional view. It can be no central role given to equilibrium, to the theory of price, to general equilibrium. It is also something that is shelving away of structural econometrics. These are the critical aspects, but there are also positive aspects which are focused on micro policy issues rather than on macro policy issues. At the same time, an inductivist attitude, looking at very small events and trying to analyze them in depth. New explanation of human behavior, so moving away from optimizing behavior. Overthrow of the view that was very often long held that economics is a non-experimental discipline. Rise of a new specialization, behavioral economics, new techniques in econometrics. So these are different overlapping ways of presenting the new streams composing the empirical turn. So the question to understand it, I believe that we must move back to the background and look what was the situation in economics before of that turn. And so I shall do that in first stage. First, I want to provide a sort of picture of economics in the 70s, and where I will show that the huge ramification that took place. So the huge ramification, look at this genealogical tree. What you can see there is, let's imagine that you were in 1970 in a conference, and that you were asking to people, what do you do for research? And what they would answer is probably the 7 slots that are in italics. And they would say, I do this, and this. But then if you push the question further, what they would say, I have a specialization. And the specialization is the use of certain tools and sort of community of people using the same methodological tools and investigating more or less the same type of questions. So this is something, it's division of labor in action in economics in 70s. And you see that there are really many of these specializations that have arisen. Now, we should pinpoint a few aspects here in this ramification. The first is neoclassical economics. So what do we need to understand by neoclassical economics? Well, it means first, father figures are Jevons, Walras, Marshall. So also classical political economy have for object the working of the market system and using for that a central concept, theory of value, theory of prices, meant to come to grips with the competitive process. So it is theory of value, but it's not the labor theory, it's subjective theory of value, meaning methodological individualism. Also, something which is central is the assumption of optimizing behavior and the substitution principle. So that's the first aspect. Neoclassical economics is going to become something very central. A second aspect that we must discuss is game theory. And so we have seen that game theory was one of these specializations, but then there is one question which is a very big question of those big questions that economists usually put aside, which is, should game theory be housed in neoclassical economics or the reverse, or should it be something else, namely that there are two different types of approaches? Now, this question may look lateral with respect to my inquiry, but you'll see that it's not the case. And the point I want to make is that they cannot be considered as a specialization within one of the other. And the reason for that are the following. First, the range of applicability is very different between them. Second, game theory doesn't consider price theory, doesn't consider market structure. Third, the rationality assumption is not the same in both of them, in the sense that in neoclassical economics, people take the decision of the others as a parameter, while of course it's something totally different in game theory, where each agent takes into account the actions of the other agents to their behavior. So these are two elements of this ramification that I want to underline. And then there is a third one, which is more institutional, which is a main institution at the time was the Coles Commission, which was located in the beginning in Chicago, and which was focusing on general equilibrium theory, which was very focusing on theory, but also on what I would call theory and measurement, with the start of the structural macroeconomic models with Klein and Goldberger. Now, among the people there in the Coles Commission, there is somebody called Charlie Koopmans, a Dutch economist who got a Nobel Prize in 1975, and who in 1947 wrote a very strong critique of what was done at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and especially of the book by Burns about business cycles. And so there he wrote the following. The title of the paper was Measurement Without Theory. So there, that's a summary of the criticism he made, saying these people make a measurement, but it has no rooting in any theory, and that's something that should really be dismissed. And this viewpoint is a viewpoint that is very important, that was very important, and that was really taken in earth at the time. And we shall see that the story that I'm going to recount is a story of a reaction to that assertion by Koopmans. So that's the first aspect of the situation in 1970, but then I must come to the next point, which is to see what was the situation of economics in the period between the 70s and the 90s. And so there, the claim that I'm going to make, and which I supported in a paper with my colleague Pensiroso, was that this was a time where something new happened in economics, which is the rise of a mainstream. Now, the mainstream is a messy notion, but we had the intuition that it could be understood in a way that makes it rigorous, and on the other hand, that makes it that gives it the ability of shedding light on the evolution of economics from then onwards up to now. And so our intuition was that the notion of mainstream should be defined as methodologically grounded, meaning by that standards for a good economic practice should be devised, and that without abiding by these standards, economics should be considered as second rank, as non-mainstream. So this idea came to the mind of Luca and myself when discussing about the history of macroeconomics, because in macroeconomics a very important revolution took place at the end of the 70s with Lucas, Kydland, and Prescott, and actually what these people intended to do and succeeded in doing was to say, we want macroeconomics to abide by the criteria for a good theoretical practice that are existing in microeconomics. And I shall point to these modeling choices in a moment. This happened in macroeconomics, and so the question we had in mind, might it be the case that this transformation which happened in macroeconomics could as well have occurred in other disciplines, and so expanding on the whole discipline to the fact that then we could argue that that something changed in economics, which is that loose standards are replaced by very specific standards proper to neoclassical theory. So we reflected, starting from macroeconomics, we reflected on which standards that might be. And so we come out with 4 modeling choices, which we believe mark the frontier between mainstream and non-mainstream. The first is to have the equilibrium notion as the corner notion of the theoretical analysis. The second is to have what we call explicit microfoundations. Microfoundations are automatically present in neoclassical theory because it is based on the idea of choice, but the dilemma here is to start the analysis from supply and demand functions, and so to skip, I would say, the optimizing decision stage. This is the case that we find in Marshall. On the contrary, in Walras wanted that a serious analysis would start with expressing the choices of the individual. And this is what we call explicit microfoundation. And the change in macroeconomics that took place was precisely that, moving from supply and demand analysis without decision-making foundation to starting with agent-making decisions. The third type of contribution is something which is also very important to us, and there we ponder on the type of contributions that exist in paper. And so we draw a taxonomy between 3 types of contribution. First are pure measurement paper. These papers make a theoretical contribution, but nothing else. Then there are theory and measurement papers. These papers make a theoretical contribution, but then, in addition, they also do an empirical testing. The third is what we call pure measurement paper. They don't do any theoretical contribution, but their contribution is to test a theoretical proposition or just to gather data about reality. And so the view that we have is that So these are modeling shows, the triad modeling shows, to be part of the methodological mainstream, it is necessary, as underlined by Koopmans, that papers are either pure theory or theory and measurement. So this is the picture. So this is the conjecture that we had. And we tested this conjecture with we're doing a case study of different subdisciplines: macroeconomics, industrial organization, labor economics, and development economics. And so the next slide will summarize the picture that the transformation that took place in macroeconomics. So yes, there I just list the different 4 benchmarks that you can see. So this is what happened in macroeconomics. There, 3 of the 4 criteria were already satisfied before, but the change that occurred was concerned only the explicit microfoundation. In the case of industrial organization, and so what is typical of macroeconomics is that this transformation prevailed in the profession, and only a minority of macroeconomists were against it. So it meant that macroeconomics became a specialization with very strict, very clear criteria for being a good practice. And the other type of papers were marginalized. They were considered as non-mainstream, and certainly publication in top journals was excluded for them. In the case of industrial organization, it was a more radical transformation. So that's the picture for industrial organization. And there you see that it is a radical transformation over all the 4 criteria, which were all missing in industrial organization as it existed in the 70s. But then if you look at the field in the 80s, you see that that due to changes that occurred mainly in MIT, and Tirol was an important figure of that, but there were others like Schmalensee who played an important role in this respect. Industrialization now in the 80s doesn't resemble any longer to what it was before. And so there also compelling criteria existed. The same can be said about development economics, but there the situation is somewhat different. But what happened in development economics is modeling strategies centered of these 4 criteria. For example, work by Stiglitz and other important Ray and other people in development economics went in that direction. The same happened in labor economics, from a very institutional organization of labor economics to people wanting to do microeconomic founded labor economics. But in these last two disciplines, the adoption of the criteria was not so obvious, so that these disciplines were split between people within the mainstream and where works within the mainstream and works out of the mainstream. So these were conjectures that Luca and myself made through looking at the history of this discipline, but of course, they were just conjectures. So the next thing to do, they were crying out for empirical testing, and this we did. So we have an empirical verification. And so we had the idea that this was also the age of certification, meaning that the top journals are trendsetters. So if there is a place where we could observe the transformation that takes place in the field, it is in the top journals. So we made, for reasons that I cannot explain, we could not make bibliometric study, so we were compelled to have a smaller sample of about 880 articles. And about these articles, we ask ourselves, what is the content? How can they be classified? on two scores. First, on the score of our mainstream, non-mainstream taxonomy, and second, on the score of our pure theory and measurement taxonomy. And the results are as follows.
Wyniki. Proszę nie zwracać za dużo uwagi na to, co tutaj jest opracowane w pracy, co do pracy, bo to są wciąż tymczasowe wyniki, ale ciemnozielona, zakreskowana część to udział prac, które spełniają kryteria mainstreamu. A więc proszę zobaczyć, tutaj nastąpi ogromna zmiana, ponieważ widzimy tutaj skok z 44 do 72%. Ten szary obszar oznacza brakujące albo nie do końca sklasyfikowane prace, które nie do końca spełniają kryteria, na przykład artykuły marszała Massela i czy też artykuły opracowania poświęcone pomiarowi, czyli tutaj widzimy znaczący spadek w tej kategorii. I ta kategoria oznaczona na niebiesko to kategoria prac czysto pomiarowych, które przynależą do podrodzaju, które będą omawiać, więc już w latach 90. widzimy wzrost tej kategorii i wyłonienie się w ogóle całej takiej kategorii. A tutaj mamy slajd na temat drugiej taksonomii. Jeżeli popatrzymy sobie na dwa niższe poziomy, więc mamy tutaj materiały zawierające treść teoretyczną i ten zakropkowany prostokąt to są materiały poświęcone, artykuł poświęcony teorii pomiarowej, więc te dwa stanowią klaster teoretyczny albo czysto teoria, albo teoria i pomiar. I teraz jeżeli połączymy te dwa górne prostokąty, te zakropkowane, widzimy, że one łączą te materiały pomiarowo czysto dotyczące pomiarów i te mieszane. I następnie widzimy ewolucję, czyli wzrost opracowań dotyczących czystych pomiarów i czysto pomiarowych i następnie teoria i pomiary. Więc ten wzrost opracowań dotyczących pomiarów jest pierwszą zemstą na Koopmanie. Widzimy, jak to się zmieniało. Natomiast widzimy, że czysty pomiar stanowi bardzo małą część publikacji w wiodących dziennikach, w wiodących wydawnictwach. One w dalszym ciągu skoncentrowane są na teorii. Czyli jak już mówiłem, pierwszym przejawem to, że zawartość teorii spadała i takich artykułów spadała, jest to, że widzimy, że te opracowania teoretyczne właśnie tutaj wynosiły 35% i potem 55%, czyli stanowił jednak dużą większość w owym momencie. I teraz druga część, przedstawienie sytuacji przed przemianą empiryczną, zwrotem empirycznym. Więc to jest sytuacja, która panowała w latach 1990. Natomiast właśnie w okresie 1990-2000 to było to przejście na empiryzm, zwrot empiryczny. Więc najpierw jednak musimy sobie wyjaśnić, na czym on polegał. Więc nie chodzi mi o to, że to był jednolity kierunek. Bardzo często się to nazywało ekonomią eksperymentalną. Natomiast tutaj mieliśmy różne rodzaje specjalizacji, a więc eksperymenty laboratoryjne i następnie mieliśmy próby randomizowane, próby kontrolne, czy też badania kontrolne i wreszcie niby eksperymenty, quasi eksperymenty, które ja nazywam inferencją przyczynową. I ja bym przegrupował te dwa pierwsze strumienie i ja bym je zawęził. No bo jeżeli nie robimy eksperymentu, nie przeprowadzamy eksperymentu, to nie nazywajmy tego naturalnym eksperymentem. To jest substytut eksperymentu. Ale tak naprawdę można powiedzieć, że niby to dotyczy tylko terminologii, ale terminologia jest ważna, ponieważ widzimy, że mamy tutaj różne specjalizacje pod taką jedną etykietą. I tutaj mamy te 3 specjalizacje. Mamy eksperyment sensu stricte, laboratoryjny, i randomizowane badania. I wreszcie mamy dane ogólne. Jeżeli pracujemy z istniejącymi danymi, z zebranymi danymi, widzimy, że identyfikacja jest bardzo ważna. Trzeba się odnosić do konkretnych strategii. Bardzo szybki przegląd tych specjalizacji. I teraz mamy tutaj pierwsze eksperymenty laboratoryjne i tutaj sięgamy do Kahnemana i Twerskiego, naszych 2 psychologów, którzy przełamowali teorię użyteczności i wyszli z założenia, które jest błędne, że ekonomiści rozumieli tą teorię jako teorię realistyczną i chcieli ją sprawdzić, weryfikować eksperymentami. Więc zaczęli robić eksperymenty ze współpracownikami, ze studentami, zadając pytania, które miały służyć ocenie tej perspektywy i stwierdzono 14 naruszeń tej metody, niezgodności tej metody. I w ten sposób właśnie ci psycholodzy zetknęli się właśnie z takim zaskakującym efektem tych działań. Są też ekonomiści, którzy stosowali metodę Thalera. Thaler dostał Nagrodę Nobla za swój wkład. Był bardzo sceptycznie podchodził do rozwoju zachowania. Mówiliśmy tutaj o zachowaniu i mówił o zachowaniach ludzkich, o zachowaniu człowieka jako homo economicusa. Więc tutaj mówimy o osobach, które dobrze sobie radziły, były w stanie pozyskać środki, mogły eksperymentować i następnie to eksperymentowanie koncentrowało się na tej samej próbie czy tej samej dziedzinie. Ale tutaj brano pod uwagę różne grupy zawodowe, sprawdzano, czy ci ludzie zachowali się jako homo economicus i nie było to zaskoczeniem, że stwierdzono, że tak nie było, że tak się nie zachowywali. Więc de facto wcześniej ekonomiści nie bronili tego poglądu, że homo economicus był realistyczny, ale tutaj mamy takie założenie, co jeśli, a co gdyby i widzimy tutaj przewidywania, predykcje, które są oparte na tych błędnych założeniach. Więc w ten sposób ten pogląd się załamał I był to rodzaj poddania się bez walki. Wszyscy zaczęli akceptować ten pogląd po prostu dlatego, że wywodziło się to z eksperymentu, ale ta linia nie zakończyła się powodzeniem. Natomiast pojawiły się inne koncepcje.
By certain circumstances, it happened that it got the interest of game theorists. And at the time, game theories was undergoing a change from classical game theories to something instrumental, saying game theory must serve practical purposes, and then raise the question, which assumptions should be taken for solving the more practical questions? And they said, well, the right way to do that is to make experiments. And so the experiments will help us to settle among different possible assumptions. And Selton is somebody who defended that very much. So behavioral economics, which was in the beginning totally experimental, evolved in something, in a subspecialization, which was very thriving, which was on the one hand decision theory. So traditional decision theory now saw a sort of subspecialization arising behavioral decision theory, and on the other hand, game theory, classical theory, saw the rise of behavioral game theory based on different assumptions drawn from experimentation. And so the irony there is that we see a field which was pure measurement and which has evolved in a field which is pure theory, because these people do game theory, they do their models, but their contribution mainly theoretical. And since game theory has the same criteria as microeconomics, fulfill the 4 criteria for the mainstream, so these people are mainstream. So the experimental part of the field is totally non-mainstream according to the 4 criteria, mainstream, theoretical mainstream, while the extended versions are mainstream because they abide by the 4 criteria. So field experiment has the long existence in other fields, epidemiology, health, and so on. And then it came to the mind of development economics that actually they could use it for solving very practical issues. And one important development was by Kramer and a co-author, Edwards, I believe, studying the issue of school absenteeism and asking the question, well, there are worms in this population. Would a deworming strategy increase so then there were different assumptions possible for explaining absenteeism in schooling, and they discovered that one that was really decisive and that would not have come to the mind without doing an experiment, and the contrast between a treatment group and a control group showed that, in fact, the policy to be taken was deworming. And so this is a group of people disenchanted from theoretical development economics, wanting to help to solve problems of poverty, who discover that this is a strategy that for very punctual questions can really make a difference, but a nudge difference, not big policy, but nonetheless solving problems. And so this became a very popular stream, and which worked with, and so different laboratories were constituted developing this line. So the main one is the Abdul Lafti Jamil Poverty Laboratory at MIT with Duflo and Banerjee. All these people got Nobel Prizes. Huh? The third specialization, causal inference, comes from another story. It's a story of people in Princeton, and one person with Aschenfelter, who was a labor economist and who was invited to act as expert for assessing government policies. And then in this process, he came to see that looking at intervention and policy interventions was a very complicated situation, and he came gradually to invent new instruments to try to solve these problems. And these new instruments actually have known a fantastic fate. There are difference and difference, there are regression, discontinuities, and things like that. And so he had a few doctorate students, Angrist, who else? Cart, not Kruger. Kruger was at Harvard, but he started teaching in Princeton. And these people took up the baton from Aschenfeld work, and they started what became, again, a very important stream, which is causal inference. So causal inference can be, people in causal inference like to put themselves under the label of experimental economics, but they can also, their contribution can also be captured in a different way by saying that what they're doing is to transform applied economics as it existed before. The problem of applied economics was that it has very loose identification, and so there were very hard criticism about that. And there's a famous paper by Liemer saying we should take the con out of econometrics. And one paper which was really the target of a criticism was a paper by Elric. We were studying the deference effect of the death penalty. And so that paper had a very important political impact. And Liemer and others were able to show that the identification were totally whimsically. So this was a real challenge to applied economics. And the very contribution of people in causal inference is to have transformed, is to have tackled this issue and produced instruments allowing for a more robust identification. And so causal inference could as well be called a new style applied economics field. So this is again, I take to show that the complicated configuration of these new streams can be summarized with these slides. You see that on the one hand, there is behavioral economics, which is two-pronged. On the one hand, experimental world. On the other hand, game theory, decision theory, which is pure theory. Then they have in common with field experiment to do real experiments so that there is no identification problem. On the other hand, so the three slots in yellow are the three new streams. On the other hand, causal inference was not the only way of attacking loose identification. There is another way, which is associated with the name of Ekman and people doing structural microeconomics. And there, so in the case of causal inference, these people are totally anti-theoretical, not atheoretical, but even more anti-theoretical. By contrast, structural microeconomics want to give an optimizing foundation to the same applied work. And so what they do is theory and measurement. And these two approaches have been in a rivalry for the last 2 decades. It is possible now that some reconciliation will take place. But so we see that causal inference is not the only way of doing new applied economics. So there is still another feature that must be added, which is that lab experiment to a certain extent and causal inference to another extent often want to understand the world, but they are not necessarily concerned with policy measures. While this is totally focus of RCT and also of structural microeconomics, and to a certain extent also for causal inference, but to a lesser extent. So that's the situation. Now, what is I would say, the statistical novelty introduced by the empirical streams? And so I return to the old tables, but now with new data. So we have the same graphs, and there we see an important difference in the sense that we see that there was an increase. The mainstream has increased in the first two decades, and then it witnesses a slight decline, but not so big a decline. But what is really impressive is the middle blue type of line, which are pure measurement paper of the new stream style. And so we see that in 2018, this paper represented about 30% of the publication in the 4 top journals that we considered, while I would say 20 years before, or 30 years before, there was just 4%. So that's a very huge increase. We see also the total disparition in these top journals of non-mainstream or non-newsstream papers. They totally disappear. Looking now at the second taxonomy, what is to observe here is now we don't look whether papers are mainstream or non-mainstream. We just look at the type of contribution that they make. And there, what we see is that there is a huge increase in pure measurement papers. Very huge, which goes from 11% to 46%. That's really very, very, very big. And at the same time, a very important decrease in pure theory papers. That is, papers which do just a theoretical contribution. They go from 55% to 40%. So that's a very important decrease. On the other hand, we must still look at the structure of the three tiers. And there we see that nonetheless, because of the importance of theory and measurement paper, nonetheless, the paper with a theoretical content are still about 60% of the publications. So we shouldn't say that the empirical stream has swept away theory. Theory is still important, but nonetheless, its importance has decreased in a very important way. What now about the explanation? Oh. Not very gifted. Huh? What now about the explanation? Well, there are what explains the turn that took place, or how could we shed light on it? So there are obvious explanations, of course. A first one, which is incontestable, is the fact of the existence of huge, abundant databases and the increase in computer ability. So these are two preconditions for the new empirical stream. And so people now can ask questions of very different type about which before we had a judgment, but without having a demonstration. And now we can demonstrate something. This is just, I would say, there is no generability, but nonetheless, this is something that is considered very important. And so we have all the causal inference papers that are published in top journals that deal with a very narrow topic, but through a very serious, they do a very serious demonstration in order to debunk counterfactuals and in order to show that indeed there's eliminating selection bias and things like that, in order to demonstrate that there is one, in a context which is the context of the more general causality revolution, there would be one explanation and one explanandum, and they can assert with a strong strength that the explanandum is really explained by the factor that is considered. Although this is still discussable, because I remember a conversation that I had with an editor of a Journal of Economic Growth saying, our big problem with the RCT or causal inference paper is that the referee reports are contradictory, which shows that indeed there is not yet a sort of automatic possibility of ranking, as is the case with the theoretical mainstream. economics has always aspired to be an art science. And so it was a sort of recognition of an insufficiency to admit that it was a non-experimental science. So the fact that now experiments were made and were considered as satisfactory was like music to the ears of economists. Now, thanks to that, I would say that they had reached a further stage in their belonging to an art science type of methodology. And so that the fact that experimentation were possible were really considered something very, very important. Then there was a third type of factor. And so there are factors which are proper to the different substreams, and one which is proper to development economics is that these people were left-wing people who started often their career doing neoclassical development economics, and then coming to a frustration of seeing that there was less empirical work done on the one hand, and that the disputes were whether there was an efficiency outcome of the market or not. And so Banerjee, you should read Banerjee biographical in his Nobel Prize lecture, where he told the stories of saying, well, I was frustrated by what I was doing. And then I met Kramer, who was a young, brilliant, earlier macroeconomist who was hired in MIT and who had started to do RCT. And Banerjee said, I had a conversation with him, a 1 hour conversation, and that was enough for me to discover that that was the obvious way to go. And since then, he, his wife, and a lot of people have followed suit. So these are general reasons. But now, I believe that these reasons are not sufficient. And I would like to see whether there's not something which is deeper. And I would like to advance the view that something deeper is at stake, and that is the identity of the economist. How does an economist define what he's doing, what is his object of study, what is the mission of his field? And there, I believe that over the period I study, something happened, a shift in the way in which economists identify themselves. We must start with Adam Smith. Adam Smith, to him, the object of economics was to elucidate the working of a market system where agents acting in an egoist way make private decisions in their own interest, and goods and services are produced and allocated according to the price system. So the question he asked was whether this system would be superior in terms of efficiency to a system which is regulated by the government. In short, what he wanted to do was to see whether there was a theory behind the invisible hand metaphor. And so in that line, what was important is the theory, the notion of equilibrium, but the theory of value. Is there a configuration of prices that make the economy efficient? And what is the mechanism, market forces, competition, that would bring that situation of equilibrium about? This definition was taken up by the other political economists and also by neoclassical economists. So neoclassical economists, we shouldn't forget that, are heir to classical political economists. The change in the theory of value notwithstanding. And so in this line, the notion of individual equilibrium, meaning optimizing behavior, and that of interactive equilibrium, meaning the compatibility of optimizing plans, are two organically notions, and one goes to the one to the other. And this view, which is not, so an identity is not something that you need to define. It is the outside observer who discovered this identity through whatever inquiry. But so it was natural to economists, classical economics, to Marshall, to Walras, to treat, to share this identity. And then came neoclassical economics, Marshall economics, Lionel Robbins, who wrote a book, The Nature and Significance of Economics, and in this book, he defined economics in the following way. Economics is the science which studies human behavior as a relationship between end and scarce means. And so the object seems to be behavior. Now, as far as we may guess from Robbins' writing, he didn't want to separate individual equilibrium from interactive equilibrium. But nonetheless, he gave that definition that opened the way for that. And indeed, what happened gradually is that the second definition, the narrow one, in which human decision is considered as possibly in isolation from the working of the market, that definition came to be more important and actually ended up supplanting the Smithian vision. And I realized that discussing with young people and asking them over lunch, how would you define economics? And most of them say decision-making, human behavior. And so, let us see, when we ask how it came that economics was considered as a non-experimental discipline, and how it strangely became considered an experimental economics, I would associate that with the change in identity. If the object of economics is assessing the working of market forces, it is difficult to use experiments. The first experiment by Vernon Smith were in that line, but they had no follow-up precisely because the subject was too complex to be, one more minute. The subject was more complex to be studied through experiment. But once the object of economics is considered decision, then indeed experiments are possible. So that's the situation. What are the prospects now? And in 2 or 3 sentences. The prospect, according to me, is that new applied theory will continue to expanding. It will expand more in theory, but that will be game theory. And so what we shall see, what we might see now, and we are going to check that, is that within the theoretical mainstream, the part of game theory would increase, and game theory is good at explaining small events, but not at addressing the Adam Smith question. So I believe that this trend will continue. But then there will come a time where in 1 decade, in 2 decades, I don't know, but when young economists are going to say, but we have forgotten to address Adam Smith. We should return to Adam Smith. And then that will be a return to the earlier view about economics. So the conclusion is that the empirical turn is not a game changer in the Copernican science of the world. Thank you very much.